Before David became a king, a warrior, or one of the most celebrated men in the Bible, he was an overlooked shepherd boy from Bethlehem. Yet one day, this young shepherd walked into a valley where an entire army was paralyzed by fear. Waiting for him was an enormous warrior named Goliath, a champion so powerful that no soldier in Israel was willing to face him. David carried no sword. He wore no armor. In his hand was only a shepherd's sling, and in his pouch were 5 smooth stones. But David possessed something Goliath did not understand. He had unshakable faith in the living God. What happened that day would silence a giant, awaken the courage of a nation, and demonstrate that no enemy is greater than the God who fights for his people. The Philistines had gathered their forces for war against Israel. They occupied one hill while the Israelite army stood on another. Between the two armies stretched the Valley of Elah. Every morning, the soldiers prepared themselves for battle. They arranged their ranks, lifted their weapons, and raised their battle cry. But neither army advanced. Then a single man stepped out from the Philistine lines. His name was Goliath, a champion from the city of Gath. He towered above ordinary men. A bronze helmet covered his head, heavy bronze armor protected his body, and an enormous spear rested in his hand. The iron point of that spear alone was heavier than many weapons carried by ordinary soldiers. A shield-bearer walked before him. Goliath stood in the valley and shouted toward the Israelite army. He demanded that Israel choose one man to fight him. If that man defeated Goliath, the Philistines would become Israel's servants. But if Goliath killed Israel's champion, Israel would serve the Philistines. Goliath's voice echoed across the valley. "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together." King Saul heard the challenge. His commanders heard it. Soldiers who had trained for war heard it. But no one stepped forward. The men of Israel were terrified. Morning and evening, Goliath returned and repeated his challenge. For 40 days, his threatening voice dominated the valley. With every appearance, Goliath seemed larger, while Israel's courage became smaller. But while an army trembled in the Valley of Elah, God was preparing someone in the quiet fields of Bethlehem. The youngest son of Jesse was tending his father's sheep. His name was David. David was not serving in the army. He had no reputation as a warrior. His older brothers were soldiers, but David had been entrusted with the family's flock. His days were spent searching for pasture, leading sheep to water, and guarding them against danger. Those quiet hills became David's secret training ground. When a lion or a bear carried away one of the sheep, David did not abandon it. He pursued the animal, rescued the lamb, and confronted the predator when it attacked him. There was no audience to celebrate his courage. No army witnessed those victories. David learned to be faithful when almost no one was watching. The wilderness trained his hands to use a sling. More importantly, it trained his heart to trust God. One morning, Jesse called David away from the flock. David's 3 oldest brothers were serving in Saul's army. Their father wanted to know whether they were safe. Jesse gave David roasted grain and 10 loaves of bread for his brothers. He also sent 10 cheeses for their commander. David was instructed to deliver the food, check on his brothers, and return with news about their welfare. It appeared to be an ordinary family errand, yet this simple act of obedience would bring David into the defining moment of his life. David rose early, left the sheep with another keeper, and traveled toward the Israelite camp. He did not arrive as a warrior looking for recognition. He arrived as an obedient son, carrying provisions for his brothers. David reached the camp as Israel's soldiers were moving toward their battle positions. They raised their battle cry and prepared themselves as though the fighting were about to begin. David left the supplies with the keeper and ran to greet his brothers. While he was speaking with them, Goliath stepped out again. David watched as the Philistine champion delivered the same insulting challenge. He also watched Israel's soldiers turn and run from him in fear. The soldiers discussed the reward Saul had promised to the man who defeated Goliath. But David was interested in something greater than the reward. He asked, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" The soldiers saw an unbeatable giant confronting Israel. David saw a mortal man openly defying God. The soldiers compared themselves with Goliath and became afraid. David compared Goliath with God and found courage. David's oldest brother, Eliab, heard him speaking with the soldiers and became angry. Eliab accused David of pride. He questioned why David had come to the camp. But David responded, "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?" He refused to allow misunderstanding, criticism, or rejection to silence his conviction. The soldiers repeated David's words until they reached King Saul. David was then summoned into the king's presence. Standing before Saul, David declared, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul looked at David and immediately saw all the reasons the plan could fail. David was young. Goliath was an experienced warrior who had trained for combat from his youth. But David told Saul what had happened while he was protecting his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear carried away a lamb, David pursued it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When the animal turned against him, David seized it and killed it. Then David revealed the true source of his confidence. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul finally agreed. "Go, and the Lord be with you." The king then dressed David in his own armor. He placed a bronze helmet on David's head and covered him with protective equipment. A sword was fastened around David's waist. But when he tried to walk, the armor restricted him. David had never tested it and could not move freely while wearing it. He removed Saul's armor. David would not enter the valley pretending to be someone else. He would use what God had already trained him to use. David took his shepherd's staff and walked toward the stream. He bent beside the water and selected 5 smooth stones, placing them carefully inside his shepherd's pouch. Then, carrying his sling in his hand, David began walking toward Goliath. With every step, the distance between fear and faith became visible. One young shepherd was advancing into a valley where an entire army had been afraid to go. Goliath also began moving forward, with his shield-bearer walking ahead of him. The contrast was overwhelming. Goliath was covered in bronze armor and armed with enormous weapons. David carried a staff, a sling, and a pouch containing 5 stones. When Goliath saw David, he despised him. "Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks?" He cursed David by his gods and threatened to give his body to the birds and wild animals. But David refused to accept the giant's description of reality. "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." David announced that the Lord would deliver Goliath into his hand. He declared that the entire world would know there was a God in Israel. Then David proclaimed the truth at the center of the story. The battle is the Lord's. The giant began moving forward. David did not retreat. He ran quickly toward the battle line to meet Goliath. As David ran, he reached into his pouch and removed 1 stone. He placed it inside the sling and began turning it. The leather cords circled faster through the air. This was the skill David had developed during countless ordinary days in Bethlehem. David released the sling. The stone flew through the air and struck Goliath directly in the forehead. It sank into his forehead, and the enormous champion fell face down upon the ground. For a brief moment, the Valley of Elah became silent. The warrior who had terrified Israel for 40 days had been brought down by a shepherd with a sling and one stone. But David did not stop when Goliath fell. David had no sword of his own, so he ran toward the fallen Philistine and stood over him. He took hold of Goliath's enormous sword, pulled it from its sheath, and used the giant's own weapon to kill him. Then, exactly as recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 17, David cut off Goliath's head with the sword. The beheading confirmed before both armies that the Philistine champion was completely defeated. Goliath would never again rise, threaten Israel, or defy the living God. David had entered the valley without a sword, yet he completed the victory using the sword that had once represented Goliath's power. When the Philistine soldiers saw that their champion was dead, their confidence collapsed. The army that had trusted in Goliath turned and fled. Then the men of Israel and Judah rose with a tremendous shout. The same soldiers who had previously retreated in fear now charged forward with courage. One young man's faith had awakened courage in an entire nation. The giant's voice, which had dominated the valley morning and evening, was permanently silenced. The impossible enemy was defeated. Israel's shame became celebration, and the overlooked shepherd from Bethlehem became the instrument through whom God delivered his people. The story of David and Goliath continues to speak because every generation eventually enters its own Valley of Elah. There are moments when fear stands before you and speaks with the voice of a giant. It may be a crisis that appears too large to overcome. It may be rejection, sickness, financial hardship, opposition, uncertainty, or a battle that has continued for years. But David teaches you not to measure your giant only by what your eyes can see. Remember what God has already brought you through. Remember the lions and bears he defeated in the hidden seasons of your life. Do not despise the quiet places where God is preparing you. David's public victory was built upon private faithfulness. Do not allow criticism to silence your obedience. Do not wear armor that does not fit you. You do not need to become someone else before God can use you. Choose your stones. Prepare faithfully. Trust completely. Then take the next obedient step. Most importantly, measure the giant against God, not God against the giant. David entered the valley as a shepherd boy, carrying a staff, a sling, and 5 stones. He walked toward an impossible opponent in the name of the Lord. One stone brought Goliath down. Goliath's own sword ended his life. The battle belonged to the Lord, and God received the glory. When fear tells you this is impossible, remember the Valley of Elah. Remember the fallen giant. Remember the young shepherd who refused to run. Remember that the size of the opposition does not determine the outcome when the battle belongs to God.